Your Excellency, Mr. President, Dr. Matsoso, Judge Claassen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. We're now moving to a slightly different format. We have done with the lightning stop pit tour of 29 different views, and we are onto a segment of the program where there will be 4 presentations, and each one will last 20 minutes. That will seem like a very long time to each of the speakers compared to the 3 minutes that we started with. So this will give the opportunity to just go in a little bit more detail into 4 subjects. The first of which is Professor Alex van der Heever, and his subject is the same that he spoke on initially. Professor van der Heever.
Thank you. I'd given a brief intro on certain of the issues that I would address now earlier, but what I want to focus on and suggest will be the kind of broad thrust of my talk is that this is a strategic reform consideration. I am aware of the fact that this is being presented without necessarily engaging with an actual institutional process of policy reform. And what often happens within such an instance is that some of the policies that are recommended don't necessarily survive when a confrontation with the actual institutional environment that you're dealing with. So with that in mind, what I'm doing is basically giving an initial sort of reaction to the problems that I've seen at the coalface. And for those that sort of don't know me, my background is as an economist, and I've worked in health economics and finance and in social security. So I've been part of quite a few government processes. I've also ran the finances for the accounting department of health for a couple of years to take them out of a deficit. Supported various provinces. I've been an expert in a number of medical legal cases against departments of health. And I've also worked in the Interdepartmental Task Team on Social Security and the Taylor Committee of Inquiry into Comprehensive Social Security Reform, dealing with the non-health related aspects of Social Security reform. And what we're discussing here falls within all of those potential spheres. So the first issue that set of issues I want to go through is to talk about a diagnostic, focusing first of all on the medico-legal claims themselves, and to give a sense of the nature of the problem that one's facing. So I'm not focusing at all on the symptomatic outcomes, but trying to get to why we are seeing those symptoms. So medico-legal contingent liability levels that we're seeing aren't real amounts that provinces are paying each year. So the question is, the scale of these sort of contingent liabilities are now at such levels that they're having second order effects on the health system. So in fact, we've got many, many health failures happening that don't result in contingent liabilities. And actually, as a consequence of that, nobody gives a damn about solving those problems. This particular outcome has resulted in an effect which is having fiscal implications, and that's why people are sort of beginning to take it seriously. The problem with the way in which they're responding to this is to knee-jerk in the direction of transferring risk to the vulnerable individuals concerned. In other words, to try and find ways of avoid paying for the liability rather than addressing the cause. And the problem with a lot of symptoms is that they don't actually truly reveal their cause, which a lot of doctors will know. So the issues has to be acknowledged that there are symptoms of a wider set of failures in the health system. And the question is, do we understand these failures? Because if we don't understand them, we can't correct them. So if the problems remain poorly diagnosed, it will not be possible to effectively address them. So a large number of the claims, as we know and as we've been discussing, are related to cerebral palsy cases relating to poor maternity services. Now, it's important to look at that because when you look internationally at how people try and assess the quality of governance and health management within a particular country, the quality of its system, they will look sometimes at a number of proxy indicators of performance. And if we had to look at the proxy indicators of performance, such as maternal mortality ratios and so on in our health system, and other people look at sort of mortality from cardiac infarct and so on, they will be looking at that information and saying, if that's running badly, everything else is also running badly. It's a proxy indicator. So in fact, when we look at the maternity cases as our proxy indicator, it's suggestive of a real problem in the performance of our health system. So the first issue, if we had to look at a set of statistics that I've obtained, an initial set from the Office of Health Standards Compliance, showed that about, and this differs slightly from the actual report that was produced, that only 11.9% of public health hospitals meet the basic Office of Health Standards compliance norm, according to this data set. And that represents about 18.8% of beds evaluated. Now that is, I would argue that the Office of Health Standards compliance norm that we're seeing is actually it's a very low bar against which services are being managed. And essentially only 11.9% of public hospitals meet a very low bar. Now, there's a further problem, is that when we look at the quality assurance scores, they don't tend to correlate properly with the maternal mortality ratio outcomes that we've got by province. So, for instance, if we had to look at the Western Cape, if we look at that sort of bottom set of tables, we've got a weighted average quality assurance score, and we've got a maternal mortality ratio, which is an average for 4 years by province. And what you will see is that, for instance, Gauteng at 72.2 as a weighted average quality score, but it's got a maternal mortality ratio of these are facility-based maternal mortality ratios, 141.1, which is substantially higher than the Western Cape, for instance. And yet on the weighted quality assurance score, they're coming up roughly similar. This to me is a problem. It means that how we're assessing quality within the provinces doesn't match up to their actual performance. So how we're actually measuring and holding services to account is quite critical. The other issue is that when you look at these outcome statistics, there are no consequences for them. If there's poor performance in the province, nobody is actually intervening to change behavior within those particular facilities. So that lack of, it's been mentioned under the accountability topic that there's a problem here. But the way in which I would frame the accountability structure is a system. A health system is made up of multiple, many subsystems. And each one of those subsystems requires an accountability, a dedicated accountability framework for that component to actually work effectively. So a hospital requires an accountability framework for it. A region requires an accountability framework. Particular components of performance require their own accountability frameworks. And there are accountability frameworks around health professionals, nurses, doctors. If each one of those are not working and not properly tuned to address the particular set of issues they're facing, you will have a general governance systems failure. We are seeing a multifaceted failure of multiple systems. And unless each of those are addressed at a systemic level, we're not going to see a change in healthcare performance, and we're not going to see a change in the cases. So institutional and governance frameworks deal with subsystems or components. They effectively deal with how incentives are aligned within those systems. So effectively, if you have no accountability framework in operating, no consequential management, no consequences to poor performance, it affects incentives to perform. And that means there's a discretion not to perform. It includes laws, organizations that are established to implement the laws, accountability frameworks, structures needed to evaluate and revise failures of the institutional framework. I'd say that all of these are dysfunctional in our current system. Getting institutional frameworks to work involves avoiding externalization of risks or negatives onto individuals or groups that are poorly represented and are unable basically to manage the risk that's transferred to them. So if we look at the medico-legal claims and say, oh dear, it's costing government too much, let's find a way not to pay out. What you've just done there is taken the best risk pooler in the country, government, and it's basically shifted the risk to the most vulnerable individuals in society, the people who have used a public facility, which means that they don't have adequate incomes, and they have been damaged by the public health system. That person, you now say, we're going to transfer to you the risk of our contingent liabilities. So that's got to be taken off the table. So in the way that you deal with the problems, you've got to deal with the sort of the multiple simultaneous subsystems failures. That's the only way to kind of describe it. And we can look at it at the sort of meta-governance level. And I would argue that that involves the absence of a coherent institutional architecture at the provincial level and decision-making from centre to regions and services. So that architecture is poorly defined and framed. There's an absence of strategic policy planning platforms. Each major area of a system actually requires a very strong policy planning and implementation platform itself. You'll find that very often major policies are just allocated to directorates or a chief directorate or something like that. That's not a policy platform. The absence of strategic accountability frameworks that tie policy to implementation. So the issue that people have pointed out about the institutionalization of policies comes down to this. If we look at the sort of what I'd call the micro-governance level, we've got a missing localized set of accountability frameworks. That's how a hospital is, for instance, governed. Does it have an independent supervisory board? So typically you'll have an accountability framework. There are 4 components to a solid accountability framework that you have to design institutionally and to ensure integrity. The first is independent supervision. The second is performance requirements. The third is transparency. In other words, you must be able to see what you're doing. And the fourth is consequences. So basically, you've got an independent supervisory structure, and we don't have them. So this is where I'd go back to any regulator that we implement, any hospital that we implement, cannot have people who are supervising that who have conflicts of interest with the people being supervised. So there has been a major problem with the political appointment process of people into these structures. So even if you have so we have advisory boards for hospitals. They have conflicts of interest. They're all political appointments. That means they've got conflicts of interest with the people who've been appointed into the hospital hierarchy itself, which creates the possibility that people don't bother. Advisory boards are not the same as supervisory boards. They have no power. They can't extract information. They can't actually apply a coherent accountability framework. And that's the reason why many of our hospitals just don't work. It's fluke if you get a good manager. So essentially, the multifaceted failures flow from this, and only one manifestation are the medical legal liabilities. So if we look at the governance frameworks that we would have to deal with, they typically are implemented by government intervention. And to be effective, you've got a top-down aspect which focuses on institutional frameworks. This is not really well understood generally, but certainly by politicians, is that institutional frameworks is kind of this network of structural interventions such as legal frameworks, policy platforms, independent regulators, and organizations, statutory organizations, non-statutory organizations that are subject to legislation. That's your framework. That institutional framework where you're dealing with a system like health has to be designed and constantly refined to work. And that top-down aspect is the framework. Think of it like YouTube provides a platform. And then you've got subsystems that involve a number of organizations and groups of organizations in which you focus on making them accountable, but they must be enabled by the institutional framework, but you're actually relying on a lot of self-organization by these groups, subject to the accountability framework. You want them to actively engage with the framework. So if we had to look at the issue of, first of all, now on who's best able to manage certain risks, and it's important to understand this. If we had to look at national government, its ability to manage the risk of medical failures is actually very high financially. Provincial governments, medium to high, because they've actually got fixed allocations. They don't have the flexibility to raise taxes, which means that if they suddenly have an exploding cost variable, or somebody at the national level has set a salary increase or cost of employment changes that have caused their costs to surge, but their budgets remain fixed, they're limited in what they can manage. So their ability to actually deal with those risks is medium to high. Public services like hospitals are relatively low. They can't carry wider risks of exploding costs. General public, they're unable to manage these risks. Patients are unable to manage these risks. Victims of medical negligence are unable to manage these risks. So this says, who's got to take responsibility for managing this risk principally in South Africa to ensure that it is properly managed? So the solution can never be the transfer of the risk to the people least able to manage them. And it's worth noting that legal action is currently the only accountability mechanism that's working. So to shut that down leaves people with nothing. So breaking down the medico-legal problem, the multifaceted governance failures that drive generalized service delivery failures, of which only one aspect drives medico-legal claims of any scale, that is the cerebral palsy cases. The pre-existing contingent liability resulting from medico-legal claims that cannot be avoided, which is now impacting on government's fiscal position. And we have a future contingent medico-legal requirement liability that will continue at the same scale unless something else changes. So a strategic approach really is required for this. So that's kind of a diagnostic of what we're seeing. In terms of health systems reform, I think it's very complex. And so the last thing you want to do is to say, yes, we will finally get this right 10 years from now, when in fact you've got a living problem on your doorstep. So addressing systemic failures of the health system has to be considered from both a short, medium and long-term basis. And I would propose that there are two tracks. Track one is that you implement interim structural reforms, which can take 1 to 3 years, that immediately address the decision-making architecture and accountability frameworks that are in place. And track two develops and institutionalizes the long-term frameworks that take longer than a period of 5 years. And you start track two today. Track two might only take effect 10 years from now, but it starts today because there's probably a 10-year lead time before it takes effect. And the longer you take to start it, the longer it takes to happen. And the problem with crisis government, which is what we've had continuously for the last 25 years, is that in fact you never get to the long term. So if we had to look at the track one framework for medical negligence, I'm not dealing with the longer term reform. It can be broken into 3 pillars. You've got to manage the financial liability, you've got to manage the legal process, and you've got to manage the health service governance framework. Those 3 need a strategy. So if we look at the interim framework for health services and systems reform, and so these would be my suggestions on where certainly where I'd begin looking. So each case of medical negligence must result in an independent investigation of the relevant service, resulting in a public report, remedial action, consequences for all parties implicated in the failure, which would include consequences for all failures to properly manage medical records. So in other words, if you fail to manage those medical records, who's responsible? I'm afraid the CEO of that hospital is responsible, and they should be fired for every case that involves this. And you will suddenly see a change in behavior within the system. And some of these crassly and improperly appointed CEOs of the hospitals who don't have to worry about the medical negligence in their system, it will start to worry them. They should be fired just for the loss of the medical records and not only for the medical case. When you see one medico-legal case before you know that it is impossible for that to happen without that CEO being implicated. The immediate implementation of localized accountability frameworks for all services. So the interim and final independent that means interim and final supervisory boards with powers to remove hospital CEOs can be implemented relatively rapidly. That means it's not a CEO or the Minister of Health who's removing or appointing CEOs. That must stop. In South Africa, that is causing the institutional rot that is causing a failure here. So that needs to change. And independent supervisory boards are what you will find in every well-managed health system around the world. We don't have it because it actually takes power away from politicians at a local level. Then you've got pre-existing and future contingent liabilities, the financial aspect. We have to move the liability off the hospital and provincial balance sheets. And I've indicated this creates a mismatch in that the institutions that are causing the liability aren't the ones paying for it. That's a problem, but it is one that you can bridge. Potentially, it should be established as a national liability. So unfortunately, government is the best and only underwriter of this kind of liability. And I would recommend that, in fact, it's ring-fenced and you deficit finance the annual liability, not the contingent liability, the annual amount that's actually paid. That's a lot less. And establish a sinking fund tied to the untapped revenue sources, of which there are potentially many. I teach public finance as part of what I do as well. Government is hugely uncreative in the way it manages its revenue and expenditure. you'd need to annuitize the liability and allow for recovery of overpayments. So without going into the detail of what that would involve, it is the movement away from lump sum payments does need to happen, and it's inappropriate that government actually pays for something that isn't a need. You need to establish independently managed contracting framework for services. So some of the suggestions that talk to service providers, that there is actually some people have proposed a medical scheme, a type of financial arrangement. It makes a lot of sense, but it's not public sector. It's a fund that gets created that contracts and manages that contract, because we cannot have open-ended fee-for-service payments, and those prices generate the liabilities of the public sector, of these budgets. Those contracts, so they need to manage contracts and service quality, and the structure should also protect beneficiaries of payouts from abuse. The legal strategy, sorry, I'll finish very quickly. Legal strategy, you should potentially, again, the legal strategy should be driven from high quality legal units at the national level, not having a different legal strategy for every province. That means that early settlements, negotiations, terms of payments, and provide a reporting framework on each case, which goes back and is compiled, and where there's a prima facie case of medical negligence, require a mandatory referral for an independent investigation. And by independent investigation, it means it's not initiated by the province. It's outside of the province. And it has to be an investigative process with statutory powers that can actually apply the remedial action I've recommended. So I'll leave it there. I haven't had a comment on the one area, which is on the road accident fund stuff. And I'll just want to make one simple comment within that. There have been, over the past few years, major processes around comprehensive social security reform. They go beyond RABs and the recommendations of the Satchwell Commission. In many ways, that framework is massively outdated. And in fact, the future comprehensive social security reform, which government has been tardy to take forward effectively, it takes that into consideration. But we can't have 5 different departments dealing with social security issues. And the Department of Transport is incapable of managing a social security policy. It is wrong. That's not what they do. So this is where the future lies there, and it's a structural inadequacy. It means we can never have coherent policy. And even to take such a long time, you think when the Satchwell Commission was completed in 2002, even to implement those remedial reforms has taken an inordinate amount of time, and that in fact reflects the capacity of the Department of Transport to deal with the social security matter. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor van der Heeven.